Hey everyone, I'm Paula Kuhumbu and I'm here in Nairobi, Kenya on Madaraka Day. Happy Madaraka Day.
Happy Madaraka Day, Paula.
I'm with Dr. Dino Martins, great friend, fellow conservationist, ecologist, scientist, so many different things.
Thank you. And it's been a wonderful Madaraka Day so far. It's sunny in Nairobi and lots of butterflies flying around. And Paula and all of us helped prepare a very nice, delicious lunch, which we've enjoyed. Happy Madaraka Day.
Yeah, well, but what are we celebrating? It's been 60 years since Kenya got freedom. What do you think? What have we achieved?
I think we've achieved a lot, and I'm an optimist. Especially, we think about over the last 60 years how much Kenya has changed, and yet in some ways we also still have so much nature. We still have wildlife. We still have incredible resources in terms of forests and savannas and coral reefs and
That's
insects.
true.
And I was just down at the coast and I was out snorkeling, and I was thinking about 60 years, and many of the corals around me are much older than 60 years. In fact, they're hundreds, if not thousands of years old.
Probably hundreds of thousands of years, maybe.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I just came back from the Philippines, and I went swimming in the coral, and the Philippines is famous for its coral, and it was maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised, but the places where I was, the coral was actually in very bad shape, very, very bad shape. And there was hardly any fish. There were fishermen everywhere. It was funny because the Philippines reminded me very much of Kenya in terms of the level of development, the people, the development, but the poverty at the same time, and the people eking out a living everywhere and any way that they can. And at the coast, everybody's out there fishing, which is what you also see at the Kenyan coast. Yeah. But you could only see tiny fish, like literally like tiny, tiny little fish. And of course, those were not the protected areas. And it made me think that we're so lucky, actually, in this country, that our coral reefs are in fairly good shape, even though we've had our ups and downs, but our coral reefs are in good shape.
They really are, and I think many of our habitats, we've changed them immensely over the last 60 years, but we've also managed to protect and steward what we can, and compared to other countries, I think we're doing pretty well. Kenya, should be proud of the fact that 60 years, after independence, we still have all of the habitats that we had, all of the species that are in the country. Some of their numbers have changed significantly, but we can't talk of an extinction of any major species in Kenya over the last 60 years.
Well, we may not call it an extinction, but wildlife populations are declining,
That
right?
is correct.
So we have recorded enormous declines, and everybody thinks about the big five.
Yeah.
The big five: elephants, rhinos, buffaloes, lions, leopards. And they think that so long as those animals are fine, everything is okay.
Yeah.
And actually, most of the times, only elephants and rhinos that we report on. But actually, there are many species that are not doing very well. I mean, look at birds of prey.
Birds of prey have really declined in both abundance as well as diversity and presence. Oh, we have a friend.
I have a friend here, sorry. What do you do with dogs?
We love them. Birds of prey are one group that definitely, if we think of vultures and the crisis that they're facing, species like, actually maybe I will be corrected about birds in extinction. The lammergeier is a species that has actually gone locally extinct in certain places. Egyptian vultures, another species that were very widespread, very common even around Nairobi, in Nairobi Park, almost disappeared. So we're seeing changes that have happened over the last 60 years. But if what's happened with elephants? What have their numbers seem to have gone up, down, and changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, first, just on the issue of extinction, the word extinction, I really hate that word.
Yeah.
Because extinction, for most people, means the last individual goes, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't even make a lot of sense, because when you're down to one animal, I mean, it's not a species anymore.
Yeah.
Even when you're on 2 animals or even 20 animals, they're elephants are amazingly adaptable.
Yeah.
So they are so huge. They live in all kinds of different habitats and environments. And just recently, making the series Secrets of the Elephants, I had this incredible opportunity to travel all across Africa and parts of Asia, and just to see how elephants have somehow survived all of the trauma we've given them.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to the Congo, these poor animals have been poached and chased and harassed for hundreds of years, and yet they're still there, and they're little tiny little families, 3-4 elephants,
Yeah.
and they are so amazing to see. And you go down to Zimbabwe, the elephants have been culled, they've been hunted, they've been poached. They are scared of people. There's another dog. They're scared of people, but they are. But they're still, their numbers are somehow increasing. And so even though
Yeah.
elephant populations in Kenya, for example, it went from 160,000 down to just 18,000 by the 1970s, 1980s. Those elephants have recovered. We're now at about 38,000, 40,000 elephants.
That's a good number
So,
of elephants.
Yeah, everyone thought that populations can't rebound. So in a way, elephants give us cause for hope, right?
They do, and if we
Yeah.
think about another big iconic animal, the wildebeest. So over 100 years ago, wildebeest populations crashed due to rinderpest, which wiped
Yeah.
out so many animals across East Africa. But over the last 100 years since the rinderpest epidemic, wildebeest numbers have been steadily going up. And that was until about sort of 15, 20 years ago. And then we're now seeing actually wildebeest numbers starting to change again because of all the challenges they're facing around, their migratory routes, the droughts,
Yeah.
yeah.
I suppose the difference between a wildebeest and an elephant, though, is that when you have a huge animal like an elephant,
Yeah.
several tons, their life cycle is totally
And so
different, right?
it's-
It's
yes.
so long. And if an elephant reproduces only every 4 or 5 years, then any knock on the population because of culling, hunting, or poaching means that you'd think, being such huge animals, it would take a very long time for them to recover. But yet they have somehow recovered, and they've recovered in Africa. We still have space for elephants.
We do.
But go to Asia, I mean, they're living cheek to jowl with people. It's unbelievable that they've been able to recover. The other animal which amazingly has recovered is humpback whales.
Yeah.
I mean, to see humpback whales in Kenyan waters is not something that I ever experienced as a child. And today we have this incredible animal migrating up and
Yeah.
down our coastline.
One of the
every year.
largest animals in the world.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
to me it is quite incredible.
Yeah.
It makes me hopeful that we've done a
Yeah.
lot of damage, but things can
We must be hopeful. And thinking about elephants, elephants are long-lived animals. So we have elephants alive today in Kenya that were born before independence.
Can you imagine?
Yeah,
That's very
yeah,
true.
yeah.
That's very true.
So-
Well, but think about our trees. Think about our
Trees,
baobabs. Let's
yeah.
go to baobabs.
Yeah,
I feel very sad about what's happened to our baobabs. They are hundreds, and some of them they say even
thousands
of
of
years old.
years. Yeah,
I mean, what was Kenya like 2,000 years ago?
Yeah.
What was it like?
Yeah.
It must have been totally different.
it
right?
was.
It was probably forested.
Yeah, it was more forested
Mm.
and much wilder, and far fewer people were one of the animals amongst many. And yes, many of the species that were there today were there as well, but we weren't in control. We weren't in charge of everything, and we obviously were not having as much of an impact. But I still think as Kenyans, we should be really proud of the fact that we still have nature. You think of the city of Nairobi, it's such a diverse city. Here there are gardens in Nairobi with hundreds of butterfly species of them. Hundreds. One garden
Yeah.
has more than 200 butterfly species, which is 4 times as many as the entire United Kingdom, So
The poverty of the UK. It's true. Many parts of the world have lost species, and I see that as poverty. That is real poverty. We are still the biodiversity billionaires
Yeah,
in Africa,
we are.
South America, and Asia. We still have all this incredible biodiversity. But I want to go back to baobabs.
Yes.
Imagine what a baobab has experienced, and if it could speak, what would it say?
It would tell a very I think heart-wrenching tale of how times have changed, but also a tale of survival. I think baobabs are one of those species like elephants that are tough. They've evolved to survive in tough conditions. But what we're doing now to baobabs, between uprooting them,
I know exactly.
but also cutting them down, for development, for quarrying, for
Yeah.
growing crops, we're losing baobabs. And one of the critical things is, I think at this point, 60 years after independence, we are recognizing the importance of trees. Trees are life to our country. We as Kenyans could not survive without trees and plants and insects and wildlife in general. Kenya right now is losing 200,000 trees a day to
200,000. How is that possible?
a day
How?
to charcoal and clearing and development and all these different
So the
aspects.
recovery of forests is actually not really happening.
And we're definitely not replacing 200,000 trees a day. And the 200,000 trees we're losing are not just trees that have come about overnight. Most of them are older than 60 years. So we're taking a heritage and consuming it at a rate that currently is not sustainable. So how do we change that trajectory? We've seen many steps have been taken to increase access to other kinds of energies, to use resources more sustainably, but we do have to confront the fact that there are a lot of people who still depend on firewood and on charcoal for a source of energy. And so things like what your brother is doing with the biogas, that's really important, because that's a genuine alternative that people can use.
But it's quite hard. I mean, I think that when you look at our forestry practices in Kenya, and I think maybe even across Africa, I worry. It keeps me up at night thinking about what's happening, not just in Kenya, but across the whole continent.
Yeah.
Think of the Congo and the possibility that we could lose the whole of the Congo rainforest. When I was in the Republic of Congo filming Secrets of the Elephants, I mean, you're an insect lover.
Yeah.
I've never seen so many insects in my life. They were just billions of them. They were everywhere. The place was so full of life. It just felt like everywhere else has already been depleted, because the Congo is so full of life and so full of water and trees, incredibly green.
Yes.
Everything is such vibrant colors, sounds. We could hear chimpanzees calling. It was really amazing. But at the same time, you go and look at what's happening in the Amazon. The Amazon is no longer sequestering carbon. The Amazon is now releasing carbon because of all the damage that is being caused.
Damage and degradation.
Yeah,
yes.
that could happen to the Congo, and not just that, it's happening here in Kenya.
It's happening
already.
here. If we look at our parks like Nairobi Park,
Yeah.
which is a beautiful park, an amazing resource in the city. I think it's like 1/5 or 1/6 of the land area of Nairobi is in the park.
Right.
Remarkable to have lions and all these other species right here in a city with millions
And
of
half
people.
the city's in the park right now as well. I was looking at pictures. Everybody's in there watching the
that's
lions.
fantastic.
There's lots of cubs right now.
But the park is facing some hugely ecological challenging issues, and I think that's what we need to do. Is if we're thinking at this moment of 60 years, looking into the future, what do we want the park to be like 40 years from now, when we'll have celebrated 100 years of independence?
But people don't even understand. Like, I was just listening to you, and we talk as scientists and as ecologists, and maybe people who just love nature. We talk about things in a way that maybe a lot of people just don't get it. They don't appreciate. Just thinking about the trees, like those ancient baobab trees, and their roots and their connections to other trees in that whole ecosystem, or any tree of those 200,000 being cut down every day. It's not just a tree, it's a integral part of an ecosystem. It could be a forest or a woodland or a savanna. And the loss of those individual trees, the impact it has is huge, but most people don't know that. They don't see it as a being in the landscape. It's just wood or building materials or something like that. And I wonder what we need to do, or what's gone wrong. Why don't we have a society that recognizes, one, we have the science, but recognizes it like in our every fiber of our body, the importance of not just trees but forests,
of living things.
ecosystems,
Yes, yeah.
but the whole ecosystem
Yeah.
functioning as an ecosystem. The idea that we can just go and plant trees and replace everything we cut doesn't even
Yeah.
make sense, because these things live interconnected with each other.
Absolutely.
You can't just
And
place another tree
each
every time
tree
you cut
has,
one.
hundreds of insects, thousands of
Yeah,
fungi,
exactly.
an infinite number of microbes, and all these other things living with it.
I was looking in the microscope at little microscopic things in the water in a piece of moss of a tree from behind the garage over there. I mean, there's all these things in the microscope.
Yes,
They look
yeah.
huge, swimming around, buzzing about, eating each other, and beautiful things.
There's so much
weird
life
looking
all
things.
around us. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So I think what we
Yeah.
need to do is we need to really, first of all, I think young people and all of us need to have a connection with nature. And you and I both were very lucky early on that we were mentored, we were supported, we were encouraged, we were given access to information, we were allowed to be curious, we were mischievous and went out and caused trouble and did
maybe you did. I was good.
and did all sorts of things in
Yeah.
nature. And I think that's really critical, is that what you're doing with the wildlife warriors to get young people to go out there to connect with nature is critical, because over the last 60 years, 60 years ago, almost everybody in Kenya had a very strong intrinsic connection with nature because of the way life was. Today, as cities have grown bigger, as we've changed the way we live, that connection isn't as strong. And we really need to make that connection strong, because when people connect with something, they understand it, they empathize, they care. And for me, empathy is really key, that we actually see all life as valuable, as interesting, and learn that actually, your well-being, your health, the air you breathe, the food you eat, the water you drink is all connected to
Yeah.
this system.
But it's quite tough, because I often hear people talking about, oh, look at those butterflies. Can you see
Yes, the swallowtails.
Is it citrus swallowtail?
Yeah.
Beautiful. It is so amazing. These rains have brought so much life.
Yes.
This garden was brown. It's unbelievable. Just a few weeks ago, it was just brown, and right now I can hear the birds. Everything has emerged.
Bees, yes.
Okay, look at super inchworms.
Okay, we'll talk
There-
about it.
We have been
There
invaded.
was one just now. Where is it gone?
We've been invaded
Yeah.
by these caterpillars.
Yes.
And I shared some pictures, and I had more comments on that post than any other comment this year. So what are these inchworms?
So the inchworms in Nairobi at the moment are caterpillars of a moth. The moth is called Amina punctum. The spot moth, or the white spot, is some of its common names. It's a tiny little brown moth that occasionally has a spot on its wings. The inchworms are, this moth is part of a family called the Geometridae of moths, who are the earth measurers. Geo means earth, Metridae means measuring, and so they're inching along, measuring the earth. And apart from measuring the earth, what are they doing? At the moment, they're feeding on the crotons, especially here in Nairobi.
And the crotons are these huge trees that are so
important
characteristic
trees,
of Nairobi. Yeah.
classic trees of the highlands of Kenya. And they are being defoliated by the
I
caterpillars.
know, I've noticed you can actually see every single squiggly branch and twig.
Yes.
I mean, it's unbelievable.
And the
There's not a single
caterpillars
leaf
are
left.
raining down on people,
You can
and
hear
in
them
their
munching.
pools, and in their ponds, and on their pets, and in their breakfast if they're
No,
sitting
it's-
outside.
you can't
and
sit
everybody's
outside.
freaking out about them. But first of all, to say, don't worry about them. They're part of nature. And yes, they are undergoing a very large eruption. And that's actually an ecological term. IRR, eruption.
Eruption, not
Not an eruption. And this eruption is a natural thing that happens across Africa, but it tends to follow dry periods. So yes, it is the intensity of it is a manifestation of how dry it was, which it was for a long period of time.
But wait. When did those eggs get laid?
So that's a very interesting thing. Is some of those eggs were laid years ago, and they've stayed as eggs and persisted for a long time. And then as the rains began, some of them hatched out, and some of the moths hatched out. I think if you might recall, a few weeks ago, there were quite a few of these moths flying around. And so that would be the natural cycle. But because of the length of the drought, a lot of the predators and parasites that keep insect numbers in check have themselves died off. So what happens when these droughts end and the rains return as they have? Butterflies and moths in particular undergo this incredible release, and their numbers just increase exponentially. And
I mean, no, it's like a complete invasion.
Yeah.
It's like we've been. I mean, I've got cardboard under the doors because they're going in the house, and they smell like fish when they get squashed. They're on your feet the whole time.
That's because of the croton that they're feeding on. But yes, it's nothing to worry about. They will naturally go through their cycle. The trees are not being killed by them. Yes, the trees are leafless, but the leaves will sprout back once the caterpillars die off. And actually, the caterpillars are raining down a huge amount of frass, which is a special word for caterpillar poo, which is going into the soil and helping stimulate a lot of activity there and nutrients moving around. So as the rains continue, more predators and parasites will appear, more caterpillars will get infected with fungi and bacteria. They'll naturally start dying off, and this happens every few years. One of the interesting things is if you talk to some of the traditional communities who have watched nature, the belief is that after a drought, if these caterpillars appear, that it means that the rains will actually be more abundant. And that's a good prediction, because we've also now been told that we will shift to an El Nino, which means a lot more rain for East Africa.
That's very interesting.
So
do we expect more caterpillars?
a few more, but for now they're dropping.
We should be saying, "Oh, frass."
We should, and we shouldn't freak out. And people have been asking whether they should spray them or control them. First of all, you'd have to spray millions of trees, which you can't do, and you shouldn't do. The caterpillars are part of the cycle. They are naturally being controlled. You'll notice actually there are certain birds that are feeding on them.
Actually, I haven't seen a single thing eating them except my sister's cat. And the cat doesn't even look happy.
The cuckoos have been eating them.
Okay.
Red-chested cuckoos, I've seen them eating them.
I did see one in the tree.
They also, I know some of the barbets were eating them. So there are a few things. They don't taste terribly great because they are feeding on croton. So there's not a lot of things that feed on them. But when they drop onto the ground,
what's wrong with croton?
So the croton itself, being a plant that produces an oil in its leaves and has many defensive chemicals, the caterpillar acquires that defense from the croton. So it's a defensive thing.
Full of yucky stuff.
It's full of yuck. So don't eat them yourself if you.
Because I know people were thinking like there's so many. Like when there's a locust invasion,
Yes.
It's almost like there's a caterpillar invasion. What can we do with all these caterpillars? Can we harvest them and feed them to our chickens? Or,
I don't. Things, a few things will eat them. The chickens wouldn't be too happy because they don't taste very good. So just enjoy them while they're there, and they're fun to watch. They're very animated.
Okay, that's another thing. They're very animated, but they do really strange things. If they're not like racing along the ground.
There's one right there.
What? Oh yeah, okay, so there's one. If they're not racing around, sometimes they're just standing on the thing and they're waving around in the air like this.
Yeah.
Or they start flapping around wildly as if they are high on drugs or something.
Yes, they probably are a bit high from the crotons, but what they're doing is that's a defensive behavior. You'll notice they have little hairs on them, and they are being targeted by ants and by now the parasites, the flies in particular, are starting to emerge, and that's a behavior they will do when they feel threatened by some particular thing coming close to them. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of weeks.
So they've all been crawling, it seems like, beeline to my doors to come into my house.
They're looking for dry places to pupate.
So they pupate,
on the ground, usually inside leaf litter or under a rock or somewhere in a corner. So the cardboard you've been laying down is the perfect place for them to come and pupate in.
It's full of them. It's really quite horrible.
And the pupae are lovely. They're little golden, sort of brown, they're long and thin. And
I think I've seen those before.
Yeah.
I've seen them around, actually, the pupa. Okay, so and then how long does this cycle take?
A few more weeks. All of it depends on the weather. So if it continues for a dry sunny spell, we might expect to see another eruption of them. But if it gets wetter, that'll naturally knock them back. And there are several moth caterpillar species that do this across Africa. There's one that occurs in the forests of the Congo into Western Kenya and parts of the coast called Achaea. and that one erupts every few years,
a different one.
and it's a different one. It's much bigger, and when that feeds in the forest, I've seen entire areas of forests, hundreds of square meters or even hectares, consumed by these caterpillars. Again, it seems drier conditions make them flourish, and when rains come, they get knocked back. But these patterns are changing. That's something for sure that is happening, and we just have to watch it, enjoy it. And...
I mean, I was thinking about it that I took some photos with my camera, and we tend to see these things and not document them. Actually, maybe we should start all documenting these things, seeing where are they happening. Like when the locust invasion happened as well, people were recording it and saying the locusts have reached this part of the country, and people were tracking where the locusts were. But I'm wondering also for kids, this has got to be fascinating.
It's a wonderful thing for kids to do, is to go out and learn and record. And not just that, if you have the caterpillars around you right now, take a few that are feeding on the croton and keep them and watch them go through their life cycle.
Oh, you mean you could just catch them and put them in a box?
In a box or a jar with a cover on the top, and they'll go through, they'll pupate. I've been rearing some, and they've all pupated this morning, and then keep the pupae, and eventually they will hatch out, and you can look at the moths. And I think it's really crucial that we understand when we see something and we are sometimes alarmed or intrigued by it, it allows us to start thinking about all these different connections. As you said, where were those eggs laid? When were they laid? Years ago. Think about it. Those tiny eggs lasting all those years of drought, now hatching out into good times. Where are these eggs going to be laid that will be laid in a few weeks? And, who's going to eat all of these?
Well, the other thing that gets me is that, so these caterpillars seem to be only eating one tree.
Yeah.
Which means that if we chop down all the crotons among the 200,000 trees being cut down every day in this country, we could lose also an entire species of moth.
Yes, and many other things that depend on it as well. So they are, they're part of the system, and we need them around us, and we need, we really need to pay attention to the details, and I think it also offers us, coming back to Kenya at 60, a 60-year-old is, kind of now at retirement stage. Not that the country is retiring or we are retiring, but I think it's also a time where we can reflect and reconsider. I think many societies around the world are reconsidering their relationship with nature. And I think at 60 is a very good time for Kenya to think, for all of our ambitions that we have as a country, as we go forward, we must really keep our nature, keep our ecosystems, keep our connection and our values and our knowledge of it as a very central part of who we are. That's what makes us Kenyan.
I totally agree with
you. The fact that we're blessed with this incredible heritage.
It is interesting that it is one of the things that is unique about this country, and one of the things that we take for granted is this incredible nature that we have, and the diversity, because we have so many different landscapes and altitudes and habitat types, and we've got the Rift Valley slicing right through the country. So there is so much amazing stuff all around us. But at the same time, we also have a lot of poverty, and I find it really hard sometimes to go into schools and talk to children about nature and fall in love with nature, and children haven't had breakfast. And I feel like we're going to be continuing, and maybe my prediction is it's going to get worse.
I think we need to really think about those connections and make sure that we, as communities, as societies, we invest in them, and recognize that actually there isn't a way out of all the many challenges we face without keeping nature intact. That actually intact nature means a better quality of life for everybody. And there's no solution to the challenges, be it poverty, climate change, development, without having a robust ecosystem.
It's interesting because we don't think about giving thanks or gratitude to the people actually who are protecting the avid dares every time we turn on the shower or run the washing machine or whatever it is we're doing. You made me think that it's true. Even I take it for granted that there will be water, or I can get water one way or another. I can probably get water, but that water could run out. And of course that happened in Cape Town, where they literally ran out of water, and everybody had to go around with jerry cans to try and and get
Yeah.
water. So it
So I
is
think we have to recognize for the next 40, 50 years that the fragility of these ecosystems. So even in the Aberdares, we are seeing places that have been degraded and need to be restored. Rangelands and savannas and grasslands across the country. And nature is resilient. So I think if we were to say as a country, we're going to spend in the next 10, 20, 40 years, by the time we turn 100, we are going to be the country that leads the whole world in conservation and in protection of our ecosystems. And we're going to use with nature,
having a bold vision,
truly sustainably. Yeah.
That would be interesting, especially if it could happen without compromising on quality of life of people today and aspirations.
Yeah.
That's what I see as a big challenge, And doing wildlife documentaries for me is a fantastic opportunity to marry the two things, right?
It is. And I think, so much more could be done in nature, storytelling, filmmaking, the creative industries, in the sciences. Right. So I've been very lucky. I've had lots of students, and I can be proud of the fact that I can say all of my students are gainfully employed. And yes, that, it has, some of them have taken many different paths, but the fact is that coming out of science and nature and natural history, they've been able to go into the world and, make a success of their life. I'm very proud of that fact.
What kind of jobs are they doing?
So they're doing many different things. Some have become entrepreneurs and gone into business. Some are in the tourism industry. Many work in NGOs in development and conservation. Some are photographers. Some are storytellers. Some have gone on to become musicians, but they all have started out with this connection with nature, and I think it has served them all well.
Well, it kind of makes sense. It kind
Yeah.
of makes sense that we should have almost like a foundational value system based on our dependence on nature, I would say, which I don't think people get.
We
do
need to
depend
have
on nature.
natural history and nature studies as a core subject in school.
Yeah,
At the moment we have biology, but even the way biology is taught is it's a very sort of hard scientific way that
how the
often
heart
turns tends to push people away from science rather than bring them in, because people think, oh, it's so hard and I can't do that. And actually, no, you're part of nature, and biology is the easiest subject. Nature is the most wonderful subject because it's a lesson you're learning every single moment of your life.
Yeah. Well, I've been really interested in watching your Facebook posts about the trainings that you do, which is those are maybe your students, but they're not your students. They are people who come to your classes, right?
Yeah.
People who come to go with you up in northern Kenya and learn about grass,
insects,
flowers, and all kinds of things. I think that is amazing. But how can we? Well, first, tell me about those classes.
So many years ago, a friend of mine, Anne Powis, and I were teaching together. We're teaching guides, and we realized that basic knowledge of nature, learning in the field, learning hands-on. A lot of people know about the things they see, but just putting it into a context that gives them a richer source of information within themselves, to be curious, to look at details, to recognize details in different things. And it really builds a very deep connection with you and the ecosystem. And so we've been teaching these courses mainly on rangelands recently, because that's a very big issue and a very important issue with climate change. And the response has been overwhelming. We have students that come from all over northern Kenya. We've had students who've traveled, hundreds of miles to take the classes. We have students who've come from other countries in East Africa, and that is showing us something, that this thirst for knowledge. The Grasses book, for example, I was amazed at how popular it is, and people, it actually was sold out in 3 months and reprinted.
So this grasses book, there are 100 species of grasses.
Just
in Kenya
100. Well, there's featured in the book, but hundreds more species that we didn't feature.
But how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me 20 years to do the book. But
20
that
years?
was more because I was being distracted doing other things. But I finished it during COVID and made sure I
Well, it's a spectacular book. I mean, I have many copies, and I'm constantly being asked by people to get them copies.
Yeah.
But I also think grass is one of those very few things which is far more accessible than birds, mammals, insects.
It's around you all the time.
Yeah, exactly. You can always go to any field and find a piece of grass.
Yeah.
And I remember once telling a friend of mine, her son is 6 years old, Wahida, her name is Wahida, and her son came out for a walk with me, and I told him about grasses, and I gave him a book and some sellotape and a pen, and I said, collect the grass heads and name them yourself. And he got so excited about this. He started collecting everything, leaves of all kinds of things, but he was especially interested in the grasses. And it made me think, wow, this is actually a great way to get kids interested in nature, because it's so accessible. You could be in a school in the most remote corner of the country and finding a piece of grass and identifying it and learning about the different parts of the grass head, which is
it's a flower. Yeah,
it's a flower, but also the fact that grass isn't just another wild plant out there, but it's directly linked to our survival.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So that the understanding that grass is the basis of all the herbivory, whether it's insects or mammals, birds or anything,
elephants, everything,
and that human beings also depend on grass.
We do. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. So the fact that wheat, corn, maize,
sugarcane,
all these things are grasses.
Yeah.
Even bamboo is a grass.
Yes.
And it's so diverse and fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my next thing is finish the big book on grasses, which will have 1,000 species in it.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, I feel like we have a big challenge ahead of us, because while you and I love animals and plants and we'll always find an excuse to go outside and look at nature, most people are watching Netflix or going to the cinema or going to the mall, watching people, not really engaging in nature. And there are so many more distractions in the world today, especially with the rise of the internet. And it's really hard to get people, especially teenagers and older, interested in nature. It's going to become harder and harder.
And I think we have to work hard at it, but I find when I do things like I take people on a walk, even the most skeptical people who are terrified of insects, and you show it to them in a context where you break through that fear and that suspicion or that apathy, suddenly, it sparks something very deep inside them. And it's about what is it to be human, is to be connected with nature. And that I find is in everyone. I have not met a single person that I feel absolutely cannot get through to them. At some level, there is some part of us, it's in our DNA, basically, to be that. And the work you're doing with the documentary series and the Wildlife Warriors is so important, because that is also saying, oh, wow, someone who looks like me, who comes from my community, who has a very similar life story to mine, from a humble background, who we don't think of as someone who would be in this role, is actually not just in this role, but doing it brilliantly and doing it successfully. I think has been a really powerful tool.
I think the challenge is, how do we make conservation and how do we make nature cool?
Yeah.
Because I see a lot of young people, and I talk to kids all the time, and I always ask them, so what do you want to be when you grow up? And they always have these like, oh, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a pilot. That's really common among boys. Most boys want to be a pilot.
Yeah.
And it's always something really, I don't know, there's a lot of, ego in it as well, right?
Yeah.
And if you say to them, how many of you want to be a ranger? Not one hand will go up. So there really is an unfortunate perception that being in conservation is not something for somebody with high aspirations. You're not going to get wealthy, you're never going to have a fancy car, you're not going to have a nice house.
Yes, and we have to change that narrative, is that actually conservation is one of the most joyous and rewarding, heartbreaking at times, but it's a very powerful way of having, a life and being part of the world. And we need it. We really need as many young Kenyans as possible to go into conservation, to think about, and conservation can be applied in every field of life. It's not just about national parks, which are very important, but you think about now Kenya has 8% of its land in national parks, but 12% in conservancies. A huge number of opportunities there for young people. Every agricultural area could also work around conservation principles and be connected with nature, pollinators, so many other aspects, soil.
But how do we make conservation make economic sense for people. Because all of our parks are surrounded by people. If you go down to Amboseli, when you drive into the gate, there's a whole bunch of women trying to sell you bracelets and necklaces and earrings, and you can't buy 10 of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
You can't never satisfy the poverty that, by buying those bracelets and things, the beadworks.
I think we have to turn the whole model of what we've done on its head in terms of how we've derived benefits from nature and how we've shared those benefits.
Okay.
Some of this is related to capitalism and globalization, which are very big things to challenge. But I do think Kenyan society could say nature is so valuable, Amboseli is so precious, Savo, Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, the coral reefs, that we believe in them as a country. We recognize their value, both intrinsic and extrinsic, and to the whole world. But we're going to make sure that we take those resources, which may be limited, and we share them more equitably. We actually make sure that revenues from some of these areas, which can be pretty significant, are distributed more fairly. We legislate that. We create mechanisms for it to be delivered to more people. We think about things like payments for ecosystem services going to people who are stewards of ecosystem. Because the problem is we only really have tourism as one of the benefits right now, and the trickle down from that, and it has, we know all the challenges around that, and pandemics and terrorism and everything else. We need to invest. I think tourism should be just like one tiny slice of this, and we've got to be creative and think about how all these aspects of nature are connected to the economy, and where they're not connected, let's make them be connected. And we're spending a lot of money as a society on many different things. How can we actually channel that to the people that need it? And so I'm a big advocate for both economic as well as non-economic valuation. You think about grasses. Grasses are so valuable. People are losing lives over grass because of lack of pasture in northern Kenya.
People are killing each other over grass.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
And we could turn that around. We could turn grass into something through restoration, ecology, into a valuable commodity. And we've seen that. We saw what your sister Sue is doing, restoring this for agricultural production, but we could do that at scale. And there are communities doing that, down in the Chulus, up in parts of northern Kenya. Individual communities, mostly women, have taken charge of the situation and said, no, we're going to turn this around. From degradation, we're going to move back to a productive ecosystem. And when we have it be productive, everyone's life and livelihood is much better.
I guess the challenge I see, though, is that increasingly land is being subdivided and people are owning their land in their numbers of acres. And by the way, women generally don't get titles, which is one of the most despicable things about the whole process of land and the whole process now of turning all these big landscapes into parcels of land. So women have been left out. It's only men, and it's only older men in general. Younger men are also not getting any properties. But what it means, though, is that when it comes to wildlife and conservation, these are benefits that come to the nation as a nation, not to individuals.
Yeah.
Individuals are being told, but you should look after these lions. But they're saying, but these lions are not actually paying my school bill. They're not paying my power,
and I think
whatever.
they should. And I think it's
hard,
not. It's hard. It's not just the lions, though. I think we should think about it at an ecosystem level. We should allow communities to derive benefits, and we all have been deriving
But which communities?
benefits.
Okay, let me ask you, what is a community?
A community is, I think, everybody is a community, but a community in a conservation sense is often people who are leading traditional or more rural lives, who live adjacent to nature, and in the case of wildlife are often paying some of the costs of hosting that wildlife.
Right.
So I would say a community, everyone is a community.
You're not part of my community. Leave. Please, dog, leave.
And I think there are many things we could do. I really think, the fact that adjacent to some of our national parks or protected areas are also some of our poorest people.
Yeah.
We need a strategy to address that poverty, but in a way that is sensitive both to the needs of the community to be done it with the dignity of their involvement and their leadership in it, but also in a way that allows us to keep and sustain those ecosystems. I know we see many good examples, whether it's grassland restoration, it's harvesting seeds, it's sustainable, production of certain things. It could be payments for ecosystem services. We have all this money for carbon coming in.
I'll tell you where I see
biodiversity offsets.
The thing is, in theory, it all sounds so fantastic, right? It all sounds amazing.
Yes.
And I don't know if you saw what recently happened in Zimbabwe, where there was a company that was had set itself up, and it was, selling carbon and producing a lot of money, and the communities were getting some money, but it turns out they were getting a tiny fraction of the actual money that was being generated. And then the government walked in and said, hey, if you're going to be making money from this carbon, which this government has been responsible for actually protecting through our policies and our procedures or whatever, then we should get 50% of this. And that company is now, I think it has actually been given an ultimatum: either you give us the money or you shut down and you leave. And because there are other companies that could still come in, the problem is that this is kind of disrupting the whole carbon market. But I'm thinking about communities and how we define communities, because to many people, until when I go for these big international meetings, there are different ways people describe people. So they describe us indigenous peoples, which in Africa it's really hard to say. When you call Africans indigenous people, am I indigenous? Are you indigenous? We feel like we're indigenous, but to some people we don't actually meet the definition of indigenous. But also community tends to reflect people who are less educated, or poor, or don't have access, or have been underprivileged or underrepresented, or I don't know, have just not had the benefits of everyone else. And so when you say the community adjacent to a park, what does that mean? What does adjacent mean? We're going to have to come up with some very difficult definitions, which will say it's within 2 kilometers. And what gives you the right to say I'm a community that is within that distance? Because these communities, they migrate, they move.
People move,
they
animals
don't
move.
actually stay in the same place.
I think it's again a question of a more equitable distribution of those benefits and resources, but it has to go hand in hand with all of us understanding that some of these ecosystems, they are both finite and fragile. They're not infinitely, sort of producing water, for example, or benefits through wildlife tourism. And if we're going to steward those, just like we steward our libraries and our museums, our healthcare systems, most of these are not money generating things, but they are very important, and we invest in them because we know that that's part of what
I agree
human
with you.
is.
Yeah.
So I think around parks, for example, a lot of the agencies get sort of hammered. Why aren't you doing better? Well, they're trying to do the best they can with very limited resources. And we could start as Kenyans, we could demand of our leaders that we resource just the parks. Just think about the parks and conservancies. Kenya is not that poor a country that we couldn't resource parks and conservancies better, so that you were less dependent on donors, and you are actually financing a more significant portion of it. And we could do that. The Kenyan taxpayer already takes the burden of a lot of those areas. We're now asking for those resources to be just better distributed, more accountably shared, and structured in a way that actually has community at the table in the leadership and governance process.
I think that there's several things, and I go to many of these meetings, government, non-government meetings, and international meetings, local meetings, and I think that it's really complex, and I know there's a solution out there. I just don't know what it is yet. But if you think about national parks and reserves, these are under the government mandate. Government is centrally required to look after those places, but the Kenya Wildlife Service is responsible for wildlife everywhere. And wildlife includes the mosquitoes that keep biting you. It's not just the big five. So their burden is not just protecting the national parks and reserves, but their burden is actually all wildlife wherever it occurs. And then you have the challenge of these communities who live in landscapes with wildlife. And some of them are benefiting from that wildlife, right? They are doing tourism and they are making quite a lot of money. And others are not benefiting, but they're paying a cost because the lions are eating their livestock. Just a couple of weeks ago, the community down in Amboseli killed 10 lions in a night. I mean, it was horrific. We had children in a school right there, 30 meters away from where the killings happened. children wrote to us telling us how ashamed they were
Yeah.
that their own community did this to the lions.
Yeah.
And I feel like if this was in the middle of London or somewhere in Connecticut or, I don't know, New Zealand, I'm pretty sure nobody would question it.
As tragic as that situation was, the fact that those children wrote and recognized that for me is one of the big breakthroughs, because we mustn't again see community as again, to your point, as like this one amorphous thing. Very homogeneous group of people. There are many different people, humans. All of us have the ability to be wonderful, to be wicked. We all have that within us. And the fact that those kids wrote, it shows you how moved they were. They have a connection with that landscape, with those lions. We need to work on that. That for me is the powerful thing. If more of those kids care, they're not going to allow
totally agree.
The lions to be.
I suppose my problem is the now.
Yeah.
Right. We have so many huge external threats. We have climate change, we have corruption, we have changes in government, we have conflicts between people, we have all this industrial development that is happening at a helter-skelter pace and in a helter-skelter way in many cases. We have a demographic bulge that is madness. Our I don't know what it is, 50% of the population is below the age of 18. I mean, it's a massive demographic bulge. We have 1 million young people looking for jobs every single year, and 1 million new people entering the job market. The demands on the economy are huge. The government is, I would say, basically, I would say almost like trying to put out all these fires everywhere. There's so many different things, and how do we identify the priorities? So I don't see government saying, oh, actually, these conservation areas matter, we're going to put more money into it. I see them looking for other ways to make those conservation areas make economic sense. Like, it could be carbon, but how you deal with wildlife outside of protected areas, that is still, I think, up in the air. But even the solutions for our protected areas, I hear some people saying, oh, we should go the model of Rwanda, which is basically $1,500 per person to enter to see the gorillas. And in the other parks, they've basically handed over management to independent companies and said, you guys get on with it. For 25 years, you get on with it. We want to focus on these other things, you guys carry on. And I think Kenya is in a very different place. I think 60 years down the road, I actually feel like we've not done enough. We've had an incredible run in terms of Africanizing our wildlife sector, but we have got so much stuff happening, and it's all happening in silos. We have wildlife is here, forestry is in a different ministry, water is another ministry, fisheries is somewhere else, and all of this is threatened by expansion of agriculture, and the land ministry is busy subdividing everything up and messing up things. So
again, I think that's where county governments could step in, and with devolution we have a mechanism to change things. I'm going to say we should think about, we'll be optimistic. I would say I'm still going to be an optimist at the end of the day on our 60th Madaraka Day anniversary.
I think we should write a Marshall Plan for conservation.
We should. I think we need a high-level panel of scientists and community leaders and artists and thinkers to advise on environment and nature and wildlife, and that they should be independent and be able to speak freely, so that we can hold ourselves, not just government, ourselves to account on this.
Yeah, I feel like, if we have our own Marshall Plan, we have our own homegrown vision, which is owned by all Kenyan citizens, and it's very clear what is expected of every person, and they're proudly part of an effort towards something that is proudly ours. That's where I see. That's why every child will be pissed off when somebody in the community goes off and kills a lion, and every child will want to have access to the national parks to go and do mathematics, or they could do any subject whatsoever, but they should be able to go into the national parks. I do see a lot of opportunity, but I also see the cost of failure, the cost of mismanagement, the cost of corruption is weighs heavy on this country.
It does, but I think we're a strong people and a wonderful people, and I think as as Kenyans, we can do it. We've survived, with keeping our ecosystems intact for 60 years as best as we can. Let's do it for the next 600 years.
All right, so 60 years time, what do you think? What's it going to look like? I know we'll probably both be gone, but well, you never know. Maybe
never
there'll
know.
be some breakthrough and we'll be around.
I think it's let's say 40 years from now, 100 when Kenya turns 100,
Okay.
and we might still be around. I really think we'll still have our parks. We'll still have a lot of wildlife. We'll still have a lot of nature. Hopefully, many areas will have transitioned away from that very desperate poverty that we see in rural areas to a more stable economy. And I think we'll have also come up with a lot more creative ways of not just using nature, but of respecting nature and benefiting from it, but really fundamentally basing that relationship on respect and on love.
Right. Well, I think if we play our cards well, and especially at this time in our history, if we figure out things like rights and equity as a nation, not just as the people, but as a nation, because so much is being stolen, really.
Yeah.
I mean, the films, I feel so bad that we've lost so much in terms of stories from Africa. We've left this continent, we never benefited from them. But there's also the biodiversity and the genetic and things like medical breakthroughs are coming from plants and animals and resources in Africa, plus the minerals and everything, that the whole world depends actually on Africa.
Yeah.
And I think if we as Kenya do take a leadership role in a smart way that doesn't get derailed, because I see so many things derailing us every other day. There's another thing derailing us, but if our leadership can hold the reins and keep us on track, I think we can become one of the most powerful countries in the continent, if not in the world, because what we have
By
is
keeping
unique.
our nature intact.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Kenya should be the world's ark for these African wildlife.
We are.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Dino.
Thank
this
you,
has been really
Paula.
amazing. I hope to do
Always
this
great
again.
to catch up. And happy Madaraka Day.
Happy Madaraka Day. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments and I will get to you.